But I want to switch it over to Michigan, the team that we should be talking about because they are defending Big Ten champs. They made it to the college football playoff. This is a team last year that exceeded expectations for a lot of people. I didn't think that they were going to be able to get over the hump, and that's not just my Ohio State bias. I wasn't sure if that team was going to be able to galvanize the way that they did, and they made a huge splash. I think a big part of that, and Hack, me and you talked about this a lot last year, Cade McNamara took a lot of crap because he's not that explosive quarterback. He's never going to be all world, but he was a guy who knew how to manage the game. He made the right passes, didn't get sacked a ton, didn't turn the football over. They were able to hand the ball off, something that we talked about that Ohio State couldn't do with consistency. And defensively, they played really well. But now you're coming into this season, and there's a question of, do we go with Cade or do we go with J.J. McCarthy, the young explosive quarterback who we saw in spurts last year, made some really good plays, but also had some young mistakes. When you look at the running back room, Hassan Haskins was really good. He's gone, but you got Corum coming back. You got Donovan Edwards, who I think is going to be a really good addition there. Offensive line, lost some pieces right there, but you get some guys healthy at wide receiver, and then you flip it over to defense. New coordinator on that side of the football. No Aiden Hutchinson, no David Ajabo, no Chris Hinton, no Josh Ross, no Dax Hill. Bunch of really good players for him. This Michigan team has some questions coming into this season. Jake, I'll ask this to you, and I'm very curious to get your authentic response. Was 2021 a fluke for the Michigan Wolverines?
I don't think it was a fluke. I thought it was kind of a turning point where, Jim going into that season after the COVID season, a lot of people wanted Jim to be fired, Michigan fans included. Mostly Michigan fans wanted him to be gone. They wanted to start fresh. And with his back against the wall, there was a fork in the road. Jim made some big time decisions. He went a lot younger with the staff, guys that were, where he was typically older NFL guys, more experienced guys. He went younger that were able to communicate with the players. Even the way he carried himself, the way he communicated with his assistant coaches and the players, it felt like the team kind of took a tough situation where they adopted this us against the world mindset, and it really paid dividends for them down the stretch. And the key word is getting the monkey off the back. I talked to some of the guys, and, even you always believe you could beat Ohio State, but going into the game, it's like, hey man, like we actually have to do it to fully believe it. And they said now that they beat them this past season, that they feel confident, like, hey, listen, David's finally slayed Goliath. We can beat these guys. Offensively, they have a bunch of talent. The quarterback battle, they can't go wrong with either guy. You have two great running backs. You return 3 offensive linemen, and you go out and get a Remington Award finalist in Olu Oluwatimi at center. Yep. So they feel great about the offensive line. I think they have one of the best offensive line coaches in the country in Sharon Moore. This might be their most talented receiver room they've had in a very, very long time. But again, I think it comes down to the coordinators too. Is Josh Gaddis, he had his best season as a coordinator last year, but he had been the Michigan coordinator for a few years. It took him a couple years of calling plays to kind of find his rhythm and find his identity.
Let me jump in on that real quick, because the rhythm and identity thing I believe is really interesting. And Hack, you spent some time around Gaddis, yep. I believe.
He was our receivers coach.
Good. He's a guy who I felt like philosophically was a little bit at odds with what Jim Harbaugh likes to be, where Josh Gaddis talked about being a little bit more wide open and trying to get athletes in space a little bit more. And Jim Harbaugh's a guy who I think is perfectly content with winning the game in a phone booth, which is totally fine because it is effective. Do you think that them having more of a collaboration, because I think we saw a little bit of both of it last year, was one of the turning points that program had?
Oh yeah. I felt you that's a great point and a great observation is, Jim had so much success doing it his way. And, I think Gaddis was finally compromised with Jim, where it's like, hey, we're going to run the ball, but let's modernize that. And you saw that with more jet sweeps, wide receiver motions. It wasn't just power offense out of 22 or 12 personnel, which is 2 tight ends or, a tight end and a fullback. They were able to get into 11 personnel with extra receivers or just stay in 12 personnel with the threat of a pass and have a number of different ways to beat you in the running game. So it was a combination of the best of both worlds. And again, that kind of speaks to the changing temperament of Jim, where, he did do that dance where he wanted to have it his way because he know it works, but he allowed and listened to his coaches so they could come to the best solution for everybody.
Hack, I got a 2-point question for you here. The first one is, if you're a quarterback who's in the midst of a battle, what is your mentality like? How are you trying to not only put your best out on the field every day, but win the locker room as well? Is the first question. The second one is, if you're sitting there and you're calling this offense and you get the final call on who should be the starter this year, based off of what you've seen, who do you think they should go with?
Well, that's interesting because I think it ties into the first question, last year being a fluke or not. I'm not going to say last year was a fluke. I just think it was a perfect storm of a lot of compromise and a lot of the right pieces, right? I think Cade, if they can run the football as effectively as they did last year, I think Cade's perfectly fine. And I don't know how you bench a guy who won consistently like that, no matter what the situation is. You know what I mean? I think you still have to roll him out there and see what happens. But again, there's been so many different circumstances that have changed that's going to be a really interesting one to peg on. And I would argue that although last year was a huge year for Jim Harbaugh, I think this year is even bigger because of all of that change and all of that influx, because he did set the standard now. And at a place like Michigan, when you set that standard, you have to carry it on. It's just like any of the other schools that we played at as well. When you set a certain standard at that place and you raise the expectation to where it has been, that's where it is. To answer your question about a quarterback battle, I really think that winning the locker room and performance on the field work hand in hand. At the end of the day, all those guys are going to look at you. And if you're a guy who knows what you're doing, can operate, can move the ball up and down the field, can correct guys when they need questions asked in the huddle, things of that nature, just taking ownership of the entire operation. I think that's invaluable. And I think that's one of the things where, if I'm evaluating the situation, it is really hard to bench a guy like Cade McNamara, who's been doing that and did it at a high level. To your point though, JJ's got a ton of God-given talent, and he got a lot of opportunities last year, relatively speaking, for a young guy in that type of situation. So it's going to be really interesting to see. And that's why I said, I think how Jim Harbaugh handles all of this is going to tell a lot moving forward as to his longevity at Michigan and the direction of the program moving forward.
The big year comment really stands out to me because I certainly agree with that. And part of the context of that too is Jim Harbaugh has his best year at Michigan and then flirts with going to the NFL. And you have to come back in and you have to face your locker room. And I know that he's a guy who could do that 100%, because the speech when you walk back in, if you're Jim Harbaugh, is, hey, I'm here for you guys. I think you guys understand what we were up against situationally. And now I'm back and I want enthusiasm unknown to mankind. And I know that the guys really are bought into that.
Let's be honest, though. Let's be honest, though. The dude took a pay cut. Took a pay cut to 100%. Stay there, and then he went out and won. So you gotta think there was a little bit of politics being played with that NFL move.
Oh yeah,
it probably was. But these cats are the players are business people too. We got NIL going on. They understand.
They should understand that.
They should, and so that's why he should be able to walk back in and say, "Listen, I thought about making a business move. Didn't work out in that regard, but I'm here and I want to repeat what we did last year. And if I'm a player and I'm mature enough, I can understand that. If you got some immature guys, then you gotta massage that a little bit. But the grown men in the locker room are going to understand. And if they want to play in the league, they got to get used to that too, because that happens all the time.
Talking to the guys in the locker room, man, I don't think, it was a big story when it was a big story, but man, so much time has passed. They went and had their ceremony. They handed out their Big Ten rings. They hugged Jim Harbaugh. After that, man, it's behind them, So it's kind of yesterday's news.
It's a good
Winning
point.
Cures all sickness.
Yeah, it's a good point. But my boy wanted to get some of that payroll back.
I'm sure you want to get the cheddar. Look, I want to get
some leverage.
My guy needed some of that payroll back.
I mean, it hurt their recruiting. At one point, they had the worst recruiting class in the Big Ten going into the
But is that a big deal anymore?
Classes are always a slow build, though. I feel like that's typical.
But they should not have the worst recruiting class in the Big Ten after beating Ohio State, and they're coming back up. But to me, it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, but is that a big deal anymore? Is that a big deal anymore
with the transfer portal? Because you can go to the transfer
portal. Is it a big deal
portal
anymore?
It's a good point. It's a good point.
I don't think it's a big deal anymore. If you can go out there and just handpick stuff, I mean, shoot, I'm coaching high school ball now, man. It's hard to get kids a look. Yeah. You're seeing guys who are like, I'm just going to keep a relationship with this guy. Right. And if he doesn't go play, doesn't get paid enough, hey, this is how it's going to work. So that's another dynamic, man. And you saw Mel Tucker do that to a T last year.
Yeah, he did. And we'll talk about them coming up here on the show. Before we get off of Michigan, though, we got to talk defense. Again, this is a unit that I had a ton of respect for a year ago. And I ran through the names of the guys that were a part of that defense and just the way that they continued to build throughout the year, the way that they got the big plays exactly when they needed them, the way that they bowed up in the face of some really good offenses stood out to me. But you lose a lot of the guys that were out there really leading the charge on that defense, not only production wise, but leadership wise. I mentioned a guy named Josh Ross, and I think that he was one of the most dependable leaders in the Big Ten Conference a year ago. You also lose Mike McDonald, and he worked some magic on the Michigan defense. He was absolutely phenomenal, right guy at the right time. As in that locker room, how are they going to reconcile with the losses that they had on the defensive side of the ball?
The leadership is a point that doesn't get talked about enough, because Aiden Hutchinson was a captain. He was your vocal leader. After they lost the Michigan State game, that was a big point in the season. He called everybody into the locker room after Monday practice and got them refocused and squared away. Because I know Michigan fans, the media, everyone was saying, oh, here we go again. The leadership was huge. Josh Ross, leader. Daxton Hill, secondary. He was a leader. Mike McDonald, obviously such a good leader. The Ravens want him back as they're trying to run for a Super Bowl. So the leadership is a big piece. They're saying Mozzie Smith is a guy that's stepping up. But, just listening to the comments throughout the program, they feel as though this year the defense, the scheme as a whole is going to shine, rather than saying, hey, we're going to have Hutch and Ojabo come up off the edge, disrupt guys. We're going to be able to get more into that Baltimore Ravens scheme where there is some more exotic blitzes and coverages. And that's going to allow us all 11 guys to play unit-wide defense. And that's what's going to shine through this year.
Right.
We'll see. I mean, that's, I think,
Yeah.
I think you make a great point, but when it's hard when you set a standard of leadership and those guys are now gone and you don't know how it's necessarily going to reverberate throughout the rest of the locker room. Right.
Yeah.
And I think when you have so many passionate leaders that in terms of setting a standard, again, it goes back to the question mark of does that message continue to reverberate within that locker room? Did it stay there? And are guys going to take advantage of that and continue it moving forward? And that's why I said, I think this year, for me, if I'm looking at Jim Harbaugh, I think this year is his biggest year, top to bottom, how he handles everything, because he has so much good going for him, but he also has a lot of question marks that he needs to get answered. And the only way you answer that is by running the ship and driving it in the right direction.
They have a favorable schedule this year, though, Josh.
They do.
They
Yeah.
have a and the out of conference lines up where you're trying to figure out your identity and your new leaders. It sets up very, very favorable schedule. Penn State, Michigan State at home, favorable crossover games.
It sets up. I totally agree with you on that. I think that they've got every opportunity to work out whatever issues may exist early on in the year. You mentioned some of the home games against some of the teams in the East that we think are going to be competitors. It certainly sets up for them. And I'll be curious to see, too. I'm with Hack. I'm in wait and see mode. I'm actually going to watch them practice tomorrow. Don't know how much we're going to get because it seems like it's going to be a quick practice. But I'm curious to be informed about what they've got going there. Before we move on, if you like what you're hearing, or even if you don't like what you're hearing, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube.